What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down for what should be a routine late-night interview, only to find himself facing a host who seems determined to turn entertainment into confrontation? Tonight, we dive into the explosive encounter that left Samuel L. Jackson walking off set, audiences stunned, and a talk show host scrambling to salvage what remained of his reputation. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how ego and poor judgment can destroy careers in real time. The tension in that studio was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and what unfolded over the next 30 minutes would become one of the most talked about moments in late-night television history. We're talking about a confrontation so intense that production assistants were literally hiding behind cameras. Audience members were pulling out their phones to record what they knew was television gold, and network executives were probably having heart attacks as they watched their carefully planned show implode in real time. But before we break down every shocking moment of this heated exchange, every verbal jab, every uncomfortable silence, and every decision that led to this disaster, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think really motivated this catastrophic breakdown. The stage was set for what producers thought would be another standard promotional appearance in the endless cycle of celebrity interviews that keep late-night television running. Samuel L. Jackson had arrived at the studio that evening in genuinely good spirits, fresh from wrapping his latest blockbuster project, carrying himself with that unmistakable confidence that comes from 5 decades of dominating every screen. He walked through those studio doors expecting to spend 20 minutes discussing his incredible career, maybe sharing a few amusing anecdotes about working with other A-list actors, and promoting his newest film to an audience that genuinely appreciated his work. The man had done hundreds of these interviews over the years, sliding into that guest chair with the ease of someone who knew exactly how these conversations were supposed to flow. But something was fundamentally different about Jimmy Kimmel that night, something that anyone paying close attention could have spotted from the moment the cameras started rolling. Behind the scenes, sources later revealed that Kimmel had been struggling with declining ratings for months, facing mounting pressure from network executives who were tired of seeing their late-night show hemorrhaging viewers to competitors who seemed to understand what modern audiences actually wanted to watch. The criticism had been brutal and relentless, with entertainment journalists writing scathing reviews about how predictable and stale his show had become, how he seemed to phone in interviews with major stars, and how desperately he needed to inject some genuine excitement into his tired format. Network executives had been holding increasingly tense meetings about the show's future, with some reportedly suggesting that major changes needed to happen immediately, or they might have to consider more drastic alternatives. The pressure to create viral moments, to generate the kind of controversy that would get people talking on social media platforms and sharing clips that could potentially save his career, had been building for weeks. What nobody expected was for Kimmel to target one of the most universally beloved and respected figures in all of Hollywood as his pathway back to relevance. The interview began exactly as these things always do, with Kimmel's standard opening, jokes and Jackson settling into the guest chair with that characteristic blend of wisdom and wit that had made him a favorite of talk show hosts for decades. For those first precious minutes, everything proceeded exactly as audiences expected. From a seasoned professional who knew how to work a room and keep viewers entertained, Jackson answered questions about his upcoming projects with genuine enthusiasm, shared behind-the-scenes stories from his illustrious career that had the audience laughing and hanging on every word, and demonstrated exactly why he had remained one of Hollywood's most bankable stars for longer than most actors could dream of sustaining success. The conversation flowed naturally through discussions of his latest film, his thoughts on how the industry had evolved during his remarkable career, and his perspective on working with younger actors who grew up watching his movies. Jackson was in his element, displaying the perfect balance of professionalism and personality. That made him such a compelling interview subject. The audience was clearly enjoying themselves, laughing at his stories and applauding his insights about the craft of acting and the business of entertainment. Then something shifted. Something so subtle that viewers at home might have missed it, but everyone in that studio felt immediately. Kimmel's demeanor changed, his questions became more pointed, and instead of following the natural rhythm of conversation that had been established, he began steering toward territory that had absolutely nothing to do with Jackson's career, his current projects, or anything that a professional interviewer should have been exploring during a promotional appearance. The first warning sign came when Kimmel brought up a social media post that Jackson had made several weeks earlier, completely ripping it out of its original context and presenting it in a way that made the actor appear hypocritical and out of touch with his own stated beliefs. It was a calculated move, clearly planned in advance, designed to put Jackson on the defensive and create the kind of uncomfortable moment that Kimmel apparently believed would generate the viral content his struggling show desperately needed. Jackson's transformation was immediate and unmistakable to everyone watching. The easy smile that had been lighting up his face throughout the interview disappeared in an instant, replaced by the kind of steely, penetrating gaze that had made him legendary in countless films where he played characters you definitely didn't want to cross. His entire body language shifted, straightening in his chair as he processed what had just happened and began formulating his response to what was clearly an ambush, disguised as entertainment. The correction came swift and devastating. In its precision, Jackson didn't raise his voice, didn't lose his composure, but he methodically dismantled Kimmel's misrepresentation of his words, explaining the actual context of his statement with the patience of someone who had dealt with media manipulation before and wasn't about to let it slide on national television. He made it crystal clear that the host had either completely misunderstood his original point or had deliberately twisted his words to create a controversy that simply didn't exist. The audience immediately sensed that something significant was happening. The casual chatter and comfortable laughter that had filled the studio moments earlier died away completely, replaced by the kind of tense silence that occurs when people realize they're witnessing something unscripted and potentially explosive. You could practically hear hearts beating as viewers both in the studio and at home recognized that this wasn't part of any planned segment. This was the moment when any experienced interviewer would have acknowledged the misunderstanding, apologized for the confusion, and smoothly transitioned back to safer ground that would allow both host and guest to save face while keeping the show moving forward. It was broadcasting 101, the kind of basic damage control that any professional should have mastered after years of conducting interviews with major celebrities who had the power to make or break careers with a single negative experience. Instead, Kimmel made the decision that would define everything that followed, a choice so catastrophically poor that it would be studied in journalism schools as an example of how not to handle a volatile interview situation. Rather than backing down, acknowledging his error, or attempting to reset the conversation, he doubled down with the kind of stubborn arrogance that suggested he either had no idea who he was dealing with or was so desperate for ratings that he was willing to sacrifice basic professionalism for a chance at viral fame. What happened next would be analyzed, dissected, and debated by media professionals, entertainment journalists, and social commentators for months afterward, becoming a case study in how quickly a routine celebrity interview could transform into a masterclass in professional destruction. Kimmel, apparently feeling cornered by Jackson's articulate and devastating dismantling of his misrepresentation, made the fatal decision to escalate rather than de-escalate, choosing to attack not just Jackson's words, but his character directly, in front of millions of viewers. The accusation came like a verbal slap across the face, delivered with the kind of smug confidence that suggested Kimmel genuinely believed he was in control of the situation. He suggested that Jackson was being fundamentally disingenuous, that the respected actor's carefully cultivated public persona was nothing more than an elaborate facade designed to hide behavior that contradicted everything he claimed to stand for. The implication was clear and devastating, that Jackson was a hypocrite who said one thing in public while living completely differently in private, and that his passionate response to being misquoted was evidence of guilt rather than righteous indignation. The transformation in Samuel L. Jackson was so immediate and complete that it felt like watching a master actor slip into one of his most intimidating screen roles, except this wasn't acting, and the stakes were very real. The man who had been patiently explaining his position suddenly straightened to his full height in that chair, his shoulders squaring as his eyes narrowed into the kind of laser focus that had made him one of the most compelling screen presences of his generation. The temperature in that studio seemed to drop several degrees in the span of a single heartbeat, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. But Jackson's response didn't come in the form of anger or outrage, which is probably what Kimmel had been hoping for in his desperate quest for viral content. Instead, it came as a question that cut straight through all the manufactured drama and exposed the rotten foundation of everything that had just transpired. With the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel, Jackson asked Kimmel directly whether this entire line of questioning had been planned in advance, whether the decision to ambush a guest with false accusations and character assassination had been discussed in production meetings and approved by network executives. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Kimmel's hesitation in responding told everyone in that studio everything they needed to know about the answer. His stammering, his inability to meet Jackson's gaze directly, his obvious discomfort at having his motivations exposed so publicly, all of it confirmed what the actor had suspected from the moment this ambush had begun. This wasn't journalism. It wasn't entertainment. It was a calculated attempt to manufacture controversy at the expense of a guest's reputation and dignity. Kimmel tried desperately to backtrack, claiming that he was simply trying to facilitate an honest conversation about important issues, that he was just asking the kind of hard questions that audiences deserved to hear answered. But his words rang hollow in the face of what everyone had just witnessed, and Jackson wasn't about to let him escape accountability for what he had done. With the methodical precision that had made him such a compelling actor, Jackson began to systematically deconstruct not just Kimmel's specific accusations, but his entire approach to conducting the interview. He pointed out the obvious lack of research that had led to the misrepresentation of his social media post, the unprofessional decision to launch personal attacks rather than engage in substantive discussion, and the transparent attempt to create manufactured outrage where none had previously existed. Every word was chosen carefully, delivered with the kind of controlled intensity that demonstrated exactly why Jackson had become one of Hollywood's most respected figures, both on and off screen. He wasn't just defending himself. He was providing a clinic in how to maintain dignity and professionalism even when facing someone who had clearly abandoned both concepts in pursuit of cheap ratings. But rather than recognizing the masterclass in grace under pressure that he was witnessing, rather than acknowledging his mistakes and attempting to salvage what remained of his credibility, Kimmel chose to double down yet again. He became increasingly defensive, his voice rising as he accused Jackson of being difficult, of not being able to take constructive criticism, of overreacting to what he characterized as simple questions designed to promote honest dialogue. Each word that came out of Kimmel's mouth only served to dig his professional grave deeper, demonstrating a complete inability to read the room, understand the gravity of the situation he had created, or recognize that he was facing someone who commanded genuine respect throughout the entertainment industry. His attempts to portray Jackson as unreasonable or overly sensitive fell flat because everyone watching could see exactly what was happening. The audience sat in stunned silence as they watched this train wreck unfold in real time. Many of them, probably wondering how they had ended up witnessing what felt like the public destruction of a television host's career. Social media was already exploding with clips and commentary, but inside that studio, the focus remained laser-sharp on the two men whose confrontation was redefining what late-night television could become when professionalism completely broke down. Jackson's patience, which had been considerable throughout this entire ordeal, finally reached its absolute limit when Kimmel made his most devastating error yet. Looking directly into the camera rather than at his host, Jackson addressed the audience both in the studio and watching at home, explaining in clear, unmistakable terms exactly what they were witnessing. He told viewers that they were seeing a textbook example of how media manipulation worked, how unscrupulous interviewers could attempt to manufacture controversy through misrepresentation and character assassination, and that he refused to be complicit in such behavior. The power dynamic in that studio had completely reversed, and everyone present understood that they were watching a masterclass in how to handle an impossible situation with grace and dignity. Jackson, despite being positioned as the guest, had taken complete control of the narrative, while Kimmel appeared increasingly desperate and out of his depth. The host made several increasingly frantic attempts to regain control of the interview, trying different approaches to put Jackson back on the defensive, but each attempt only highlighted his fundamental inability to handle the situation he had created. That's when Kimmel crossed the line that would define the rest of his career, making a comment so inappropriate and unprofessional that it would be remembered long after everything else about this interview had been forgotten. The moment that would be replayed countless times across social media platforms and analyzed by media critics for years to come happened so quickly that some viewers initially missed its significance, but its impact was immediately felt by everyone in that studio. In what can only be described as a moment of complete professional suicide, Kimmel made a personal attack directed at Jackson's family, suggesting that the actor's passionate and principled response to being misrepresented on national television was somehow influenced by personal issues rather than legitimate professional concerns about media ethics and basic human decency. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and the moment they left Kimmel's mouth, everyone present understood that the interview was effectively over. There are certain lines that simply cannot be crossed in professional settings, certain boundaries that separate legitimate journalism from tabloid harassment, and Kimmel had just obliterated those boundaries in front of millions of viewers who would never forget what they had witnessed. Jackson's response came with the kind of measured intensity that had made him one of the most compelling actors of his generation. But this wasn't a performance, and the emotions were absolutely genuine. He didn't explode into the kind of theatrical anger that Kimmel had probably been hoping for, didn't provide the viral moment of celebrity meltdown that would have given the host exactly what he wanted. Instead, Jackson simply stood up with the kind of quiet dignity that spoke volumes about his character, removed his microphone with deliberate precision, and made it absolutely clear that he would not continue to participate in what had devolved into nothing more than a character assassination disguised as entertainment. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Jackson's footsteps as he prepared to leave the set, with his reputation intact and his principles uncompromised. It was a masterclass in how to handle an impossible situation, demonstrating that there were still people in Hollywood who valued integrity over publicity, and who wouldn't sacrifice their dignity for the sake of someone else's desperate ratings. Grab Kimmel, perhaps finally beginning to grasp the magnitude of his error and the potential consequences for his career, made increasingly desperate attempts to convince Jackson to stay, to continue the interview, to give him a chance to somehow salvage the disaster he had created. But his pleas fell on deaf ears because the damage had already been done, and Jackson had made his decision based on principles that couldn't be negotiated or compromised. The actor's final words to Kimmel were delivered with the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of commanding respect in one of the world's most challenging industries. He told the host that professionalism and basic human decency weren't optional extras in their business, that guests who agreed to appear on television shows deserved to be treated with respect rather than ambushed with manufactured controversies, and that Kimmel had failed to meet even the most basic standards expected of someone in his position. But Jackson wasn't finished, and what he did next elevated his response from merely professional to genuinely inspiring. He turned to address the studio audience directly, speaking not just to the people sitting in those chairs but to everyone watching at home who had been subjected to this uncomfortable spectacle. He thanked them for their time and attention, apologized that they had been forced to witness such unprofessional behavior, and made it crystal clear that his decision to leave was based on principle rather than ego or any inability to handle tough questions. His grace under the most intense pressure stood in stark contrast to the chaos and desperation that Kimmel had brought to what should have been a routine promotional interview. The difference between a true professional and someone who was willing to sacrifice basic decency for ratings couldn't have been more obvious to everyone watching. As Jackson walked off that set with his head held high, the cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of Kimmel's increasingly frantic attempts to explain what had just happened to his confused and uncomfortable audience. The host tried to minimize the significance of what viewers had just witnessed, suggesting that it was all just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, that Jackson had overreacted to legitimate questions, and that sometimes interviews simply don't go according to plan. But his words rang completely hollow in the face of what everyone had just seen unfold in real time. The audience remained largely silent as Kimmel attempted to continue with his show, bringing out his next scheduled guest and pretending that nothing unusual had occurred. However, the energy in that studio had been completely destroyed, and it was painfully obvious to everyone present that they had just witnessed something unprecedented in late-night television history. Behind the scenes, production staff members were reportedly scrambling to figure out how to handle the public relations nightmare that was already beginning to unfold across social media platforms. The encounter had been broadcast live, which meant that every uncomfortable moment, every inappropriate comment, and every second of Jackson's dignified exit had been seen by viewers across the country without any opportunity for editing or damage. Controlled Kimmel's attempt to maintain some semblance of normalcy for the remainder of the show was genuinely painful to watch for anyone who understood how television was supposed to work. His timing was completely off. His prepared jokes fell flat with an audience that was still processing what they had witnessed, and it was crystal clear that his confidence had been absolutely shattered by his encounter with someone who refused to be bullied or manipulated on national television. The remaining segments of the show felt forced and awkward, as if everyone involved was simply going through the motions until they could get off the air and begin dealing with the aftermath of what had become a public relations disaster of epic proportions. The most telling moment came during Kimmel's closing monologue, when he briefly addressed what had happened earlier, without actually taking any responsibility for his role in creating the entire situation. He offered vague platitudes about how sometimes interviews don't go as planned, and suggested that different people have different perspectives on what constitutes appropriate discourse in public forums. It was a non-apology that fooled absolutely no one and only served to highlight his complete inability to acknowledge his mistakes or take responsibility for the unprofessional behavior that had driven one of Hollywood's most respected figures to walk off his show. The contrast between Jackson's accountability and Kimmel's deflection couldn't have been more stark or damaging to whatever remained of the host's credibility. As the show finally ended and the credits rolled over, what had become one of the most uncomfortable hours in late-night television history, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted in the entertainment landscape. Samuel L. Jackson had demonstrated that there were still people in Hollywood who wouldn't compromise their principles for the sake of ratings or publicity, while Jimmy Kimmel had shown the world what happens when desperation for relevance leads someone to make catastrophically poor decisions that destroy relationships and reputations in real time. The silence that followed Jackson's departure spoke volumes about the respect he commanded throughout the industry and the profound disappointment felt by everyone who had witnessed Kimmel's unprofessional behavior. It served as a powerful reminder that in an industry built entirely on relationships and reputation, burning bridges with universally respected figures comes at a cost that extends far beyond any single interview or television appearance. What Did you think about Samuel L. Jackson's handling of this impossible situation? Do you believe he was absolutely right to walk off when his dignity was attacked? Or should he have stayed to finish the interview despite the host's unprofessional behavior? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. For more stories about the moments when Hollywood's biggest stars show us exactly who they really are when the pressure is on.